so we can introduce Mary Louise Roberts, who I think goes by Lou, correct? All right.
Yes, sir.
So she is a professor at the University of Wisconsin up in Madison. And tonight I am going to do something a little bit different, folks, when I'm talking to our author tonight, in that there's so many very interesting points that are made in this book. I want to read the quotes and ask Lou if she will explain them and talk about them more. So you probably will see me kind of reading a sentence or two out of the book a little bit more than usual. But welcome to Lou Roberts, who's going to talk to us about sheer misery. Good evening to you.
Good evening. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks for everyone from around the country to seeing me.
Welcome to our program tonight, and we're looking forward to talking about the soldier experience in World War II. And I guess the first question I wanted to know before I even finished the book is, what kind of got you started into researching and writing and learning more about the common soldier experience in World War II?
Okay, thanks. Great question, John. I guess there were two sources of inspiration. One, 2 books ago, I wrote this book called What Soldiers Do. And I had read a lot of infantry memoirs for that book. And I realized that the infantrymen's war was very different from the officers' war. And because he didn't really have a conceptual or abstract view of strategy or operations or tactics, he really lived the war through his body, cold and hot and wet, and discomfort and dirt and wounds. So I thought, no one really has written about this, what I call somatic experience of war, experiencing a war through a body. So that was one thing I was sort of thinking about. And What Soldiers Do was a controversial book. And one of the talks that I gave about it, a young veteran came up and said to me, I don't know why you wrote this book, because you really don't know what it's like. You're an academic and an historian. And I took the point, but I also really loved the question, what was it really like to fight a war? And I didn't know. So those were the two motivations I had to write Sheer Misery. And, off the record too, I just love infantry memoirs. There's a particular place in the Wisconsin Historical Society where they all are on floor 5. And I just wanted to spend more time up there reading these memoirs. I thought they were amazing. So I guess that was sort of the motivating force for me.
You have divided the contents into 5 major chapters.
Mm-hmm.
The first one being the senses. And what I think you alluded to a little bit in your last answer, but how did you decide on the structure of the book into your 5 chapters?
Well, it's not highly structured. In the introduction, I describe it as a series of essays. So the senses was the first chapter because it seemed really basic to me. And in that, I deal with hearing and smell on the battlefield, as well as the 7th sense, and food, taste. I don't do vision because I have a whole chapter on the sight of a dead body. And that seemed basic to me because what the average foot soldier was in an environment that was completely alien to him, the battlefield, particularly new recruits. And they had to make sense of it somehow. And I took the notion of making sense and thought about how they made sense through their senses. So for example, sound. soldiers became experts in sound and distinguishing one sound from another. And they used sound strategically. They learned when something was going to go overhead and when it was going to hit you. They knew what was going the other way and what was coming this way. They learned the sounds of different machine guns, the difference between a German machine gun and an American one. And all these things help to locate them on the battlefield and to make sense of the battlefield. They're just literally using sound to orient themselves. So the senses are all like that in some way. Not strategic. Smell, for example, was not strategic, but helped infantrymen to just understand their environment and make sense of it. And I don't think we can really know what it was like unless we experience it ourselves. But we can know what meaning soldiers gave to those battlefields through their senses. So that's why I did that one first. And there's no other particular structure. This was really an exploratory volume for me. No one that I know has ever done something like this. And so I just did a bunch of essays that seemed really important to me and put them together.
Good. So one of the things that runs through each chapter is this notion that once the soldiers were in the Army, that they no longer, quote, owned or had control of their bodies, and that the Army, the military, the officers, the decision makers, commanders, really were making the decisions on what was going to happen to your body just by the orders, the operations, deciding, attack or defend, things like that. How did that develop in your thinking as you were researching and writing this?
Well, I actually think, I did a lot of induction processes. And the British went from one doctor to another. Somebody did the chest, somebody did the arm muscles, somebody did the private parts, and so on and so forth. So they were really examining these human beings, these persons as bodies. And then basic training was very much like that too. It was really about physical strain and endurance. And it was physical more than mental. But the other thing about the body that seems to run through the book is that the way an officer looked at a body of a soldier and the way the soldier looked at his own body were very different. So a soldier understood the cold as a series of painful sensations, whereas the officers understood cold as something which is going to perhaps limit or deter success on the battlefield. So for the officer, he saw the body as a kind of, the soldier's body as a sort of abstract unit of force. And you needed so many bodies in a particular place to win a battle, in hopefully agreeable operations in terms of weather and other conditions. So, so what was interesting to me was not only did the officers in the Army own the infantryman's body, but they looked at the body really differently. And officers had to do that. They had to look at these men as bodies because otherwise it would be much harder for them to send men into harm's way. And my example of that is Patton. I read his diary, and at one point he goes to the hospital, I believe it was in Sicily, and he sees all these men really suffering, and he starts to cry, and he says to his diary, I really can't think about that kind of physical suffering because otherwise I would not be able to send men into battle. So, when you think about operations and strategy and tactics, it's about putting, abstract units of force, i.e. soldiers, into battle. But for the soldiers themselves, they understood their body as a sensate being. So it was a really interesting, different conception between high up officers. And then, of course, there were men who were NCOs who had risen from the ranks, and they understood both sides of this. So it wasn't clear cut by any chance.
Well, let's talk about the first chapter, which is the senses that we were talking about. And one of the interesting lines that you write is, when it came to surviving the front line, hearing was the most important sense.
Right.
Why is that? What do you mean by that?
Because they used it strategically, as I said. They used it to locate themselves on the battle and to find out when they had to duck and when they had to cover and when, in fact, the bullets were going the other way. So in terms of surviving, it was the most useful sense for them, because remember, this is an era in which artillery is out of sight. So it became really important. And another thing that was lovely was, the new green recruits would come online, and the older so-called veterans of the line would teach the younger men. So it actually created a kind of bond among infantrymen to teach everyone these sounds that will survive.
So the next interesting point that I came across, what I thought was interesting, was about smell and the smell of the battlefield. And you write, the smell, unlike sound, the smell of battle had little strategic value, and soldiers tried to ignore them. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of noxious smells in the battlefield. One was the smell of dead bodies. But what was interesting to me about smell was it transcribed the chaos of the battle, because you had both the smell of, the artillery and the gunpowder, and then you also had the smell of dead bodies or wounded bodies. So you had both the weapon and its effects. You smelled cordite, and then you smelled pus and blood. So in some ways, it was represented the stakes of the battle and how you could get hurt. And then, look, the infantrymen were really stinky. It was very hard for them to get a shower. So, if you sleep in a hole and you don't take a shower for 3 weeks, you smell. So it wasn't strategic at all.
Yeah. So an interesting line you take on food and smell and taste.
Yeah.
So and I think you make some remark I can't really find right now, but that soldiers universally talk about how bad the food was, or how they wanted more of it and couldn't get enough of it. But taste, you write. The quote I'll read here that I want you to talk about is, if food had stood for pleasure back home, it now stood for misery at the front.
There is one of my favorite, probably my favorite GI. I read, over 100 of these, but I loved his name was Leroy Stewart. And he said when he was on the line, he would have this recurring dream. And the dream was he woke up in the hospital, he was clean, and he was eating a gigantic plate of mashed potatoes. I just love that. So I investigated a lot of the quartermaster reports and tried to figure out, why did the food taste so bad? And it had to be, there were a lot of really difficult logistic problems. You had to send food really far distances. So there was no fresh food. And then a lot of times the men were up at on the line, and the cook didn't want to come up. It was too dangerous. So they were eating K rations or C rations, and sometimes they were frozen. So I think the quartermasters tried to make food good, and the same thing with the British, but there were logistical problems that made it really difficult. Yeah.
Did you find any significant differences between the experiences of the GIs versus the British soldiers?
Not really. And I did look at German soldiers as well, not as much. The reason is the two battles that I looked at, which was the Battle of the Bulge, and also the Italian Mountain battle in 43-44. The Germans mostly were on the Eastern Front. Only, a minority of German soldiers were there. And when they're on the Eastern Front, they complained a lot. But I wasn't able to find a lot of German diaries. And the ones I found are letters home were much more stoical. So not surprisingly, the Americans were the biggest whiners, and then probably the British after them. The British had better boots than the Americans because they had learned in the First World War that trench foot was a real problem.
Right. I have a question about that in that whole chapter, which is
so
probably...
I think everyone was miserable, but I think the American Army had the worst foot misery. And I have a wonderful anecdote about a German soldier. He was about to be captured. The Americans were about 50 yards away from him with guns on him. And he saw 3 pairs of boots in front of him. And he tried the first pair on and one fell apart. Tried the second pair on and they were too small. And then he was trying the third pair on and he dropped it. So to me, it showed just how important footwear is for infantry.
We'll come back to the footwear in the trench foot chapter, which was fascinating. Staying with taste and the food, I double underline this chapter topic sentence. Paragraph. Most importantly, rations affronted your dignity. So what do you mean by that? And how did that work and why?
It's a great question, John. I think if you were an infantryman, you knew that you were kind of bottom of the line. You went into the infantry if you couldn't pass a test to go into other areas of the Army. And so there are a lot of uneducated working class men on the line. And they felt that indignity. They felt a lot of class condescension from officers, except for, immediate NCOs. And they just felt like they were the dirty, horrible infantry, the bloody old infantry, as the British would say. And so I think the bad food added to their sense of humiliation, that they were treated, here they are putting their life on the line every day and they're having crummy food. So I think it could have been anything, any mistreatment. And they would have felt, and so being angry about the food was a way to assert their dignity and their belief that they deserve better than that.
So the line that you close one section with is to bitch about food was to insist on the humanity and dignity of the foot soldier, right? That I really like that quote a lot.
Yeah, that is exactly what I just said, right? They just, all soldiers bitch about the food, right? It's
so also in senses, which I would not have thought of this on my own, because when I hear senses, I think sight, taste, touch, smell. But you talk about a sixth sense, and a great passage or a great section there on that. Tell us about that. What does that mean?
Well, I think a lot of men that remember buddies that would say on the day that they would get wounded or killed that today's my day. And this kept coming up. But my favorite instance of it is there was a soldier, Italian soldier and Italian-American soldier, and he was on the line with another guy, and they're both in a hole. And he gets this sort of message from his mother. He dreams that his mother's telling him to get up and get out of that hole. And he wakes up and he turns to his buddy and he says, I got to get out of this hole. I just had this dream. My mother told me this. And the guy, it's like 3 in the morning. The guy's like, are you out of your mind? I'm not going to dig another trench hole. And he says, don't worry about it. I'll do all the digging and then we'll come across. So he goes and he digs another foxhole. And, the guy says, okay, I'll come in there. And an hour later, there's an artillery barrage, and the first foxhole was completely destroyed. Now, to me, that's just, a mother's connection with a son. Something, every history should have something we can't really explain. So there was this, because they were so helpless, so impotent, they were basically knew that they could die very easily. And I think these superstitions and, realizing the day they're going to be wounded, it's a way of controlling the situation.
So your next chapter is on the dirty body. And everybody who's been in the military or read about the military or seen a movie about the military knows that it's pretty dirty. It's not like a farmer that showers after dinner at night or other dirty jobs that we see where it's 9 to 5. And you the quote that you make is to be successful on the battlefield, soldiers had to get dirty. So what is in this chapter about getting dirty that, obviously we all know soldiers get dirty, but what's in there that will make people interested even more?
So this chapter was never planned. It just sort of grew out of the Trenchfoot chapter. And the reason I did it was because I have long loved Bill Mauldin, Willie and Joe. I think it's just a wonderful source. And historians have always used it as illustrations of the front or the line. But no one's ever actually looked at what Mauldin is doing or trying to do. And Mauldin himself was an infantryman. He was in the 36th Division, deployed in Italy. And he started writing for the unit paper and doing cartoons. And they became so popular that he ended up writing for Stars and Stripes, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for cartoonists in 1944. And I think everybody knows Willie and Joe, and they're a filthy pair. So I studied the cartoons really carefully, and what I began to realize is that Mauldin pulls off this amazing sort of cultural reversal, because Willie and Joe are filthy, but they're the real men doing the real fighting. And if you look at the way Mauldin portrays, officers back behind the line, they're always lily-livered white and clean. And they always look sort of weak and emasculated. And so, the soldier is taught in basic to be absolutely clean, and cleanliness is orderliness, and so on and so forth. But so that when they started to get dirty, they felt an incredible amount of shame. And so what I think Mauldin did so brilliantly was to make it possible for soldiers to embrace their dirt and their dirty bodies by making dirt a sign of heroism, dirt a sign of who's doing the real fighting, who's really the man. And I start and end the chapter with a famous argument between Bill Mauldin and Patton. Right. Patton hated Bill Mauldin, hated Willie and Joe, and he didn't want Stars and Stripes in the army, his army, the Third Army, because of that. And Eisenhower was really concerned about this, because Eisenhower really wanted to keep Stars and Stripes a real paper, not a propaganda sheet, a real paper that the GIs wanted to read. And Mauldin by then was incredibly popular. So it's arranged for Mauldin to go and meet Patton. And it's absolutely hilarious, his account of it, because he goes in there. First of all, he's like clean to a polish, okay? And he goes in there, and of course, Patton takes out a cartoon and starts to scream at him about it. But in fact, the way it turned out, Mauldin won. And his cartoon stayed in the Stars and Stripes. And So in some ways, it's about, again, the triumph of the dirty body over the white one, in terms of you don't need to be cleanly or clean to be the man, the real fighter in the army. So it turned out that dirt and cleanliness had a real politics, and it kind of got played out in the Malden cartoons. And nothing has been done on Malden, really looking at his cartoons. So it was a really fun opportunity for me, and I love him more than ever now.
We're currently talking about the soldier and dirt and cleanliness, and there's an interesting little section here where you say, to soldiers in battle, hygiene rules look more and more like control for control's sake. So how did you come to the conclusion? What were the soldiers saying that made it look like we're just going through the motions?
Well, the whole notion of Willie and Joe and the dirty soldier began in the Italian Mountain Campaign during the winter of 43-44. And so, the soldiers were deployed on the mountain, literally on the mountains in the central Italy. And so every single thing had to be brought up by donkey. And it was a very perilous trip. So there was not a lot of water. And what water they had, they used to drink, not to wash themselves. And there were all kinds of jokes, again, Malden, saying, well, don't worry, just drink it because no officer's coming up here. But that's when it started. And that's when Willie and Joe were born. And in particular, Malden was, I think, in Naples, someplace in southern Italy. And he saw some infantrymen coming down and going on leave. And they were so smelly, as Malden said, you could smell them a mile away, that the person in charge put them in jail for 3 days just to get rid of them. And then after the third day, they all took a shower and then they went back to the mountains. So a lot of this was inspired by the bad treatment infantrymen had and how they got around it. They just decided they're not going to wash. And in a situation like that, where you're on a mountaintop and you're in, harm's way all the time, and you don't have very much water, hygiene looks like control for control's sake.
Got it. Sure. Okay. I do want to point out to folks there are several of the Bill Malden cartoons as illustrations in the book, which are really, really good additions to the story here. Let me move on to the chapter after the dirty body of the foot. And this is my favorite chapter, chapter 3, the foot. Who knew?
Love it. Yeah.
Who knew that the foot would be a big chapter in the book? But people who read military history and people who've seen story or had their fathers or grandfathers tell them about the war and things like that, we all hear about trench foot. But there's a lot more to it than that, isn't there? It's not just your feet getting a little uncomfortable.
When you're an infantryman, you're walking all the time, right? You're a foot soldier. That's the whole thing. So if you don't have comfortable shoes, you're busted, right? And it became a real problem in 43-44 in Italy, which is where it was also a problem in the Battle of Bulge, but more in Italy, and because it was so wet and muddy the whole time. And trench foot is created when you put your feet not in snow or ice, but in water which is almost freezing. And essentially what happens is your feet can go gangrenous and you have to have them taken off. And there were a lot of these things happening. It was a big problem. So the quartermasters, this is when the boots started to break down. Boots, were made of recycled rubber on the bottom. The quartermaster did what he could, but recycled rubber is just not an ideal walking shoe, or particularly a shoe in the wet, because it just broke down. So part of the problem was bad shoes, but the other part of the problem was distribution, because what would happen is a big ship would come into Naples or someplace like that, and it would have what were called, I don't know, like rubber overshoes for the infantrymen. But of course, everyone on the boat and then everyone who's in the port helped themselves to the thing. So infantrymen would literally come back to, you know, the rear and see people walking around with these gorgeous overshoes. And by the time they actually got to the infantrymen themselves, you know, there was size 5, size 6, and size 15 and 16. So a lot of men were wearing boots that were either too big for them or too small for them. And so it was basically wartime materials. And then it was also bad distribution, really, black market and so on and so forth.
And I think you make the point that a lot of times the soldiers who were coming off the front line for R&R or to have the unit rest, when they get back to the supply areas and see how well supplied everybody was with winter coats and winter boots and food, created some pretty significant morale problems.
Yeah, I mean, you could imagine if you're the one who's doing, you know, living out in the cold and the wet and the rain, and you don't have the supplies that people who have a nice neat bed at night have, you know. So it was, you know, again, part of that humiliation of the infantrymen and how they felt they were, you know, treated badly, as with the food. So, and then the worst part was that the Army, rather than fully recognize these problems, and again, it was Patton who had a lot of problems in the winter of 44, Battle of the Bulge, rather than actually say, okay, we've got bad boots and we've got a supply problem. And they did do that, you know, the Army tried with the supply problem. You know, they set quotas and things like that so that some of the boots would reach the infantrymen. They did try, but they also blamed the infantrymen for not drying their feet and cleaning their feet every night. And, you know, there was this just infuriated people. There was one soldier who got a Time magazine to this effect, you know, the soldiers aren't taking care of themselves, it's a discipline problem. And he said, well, I guess we're supposed to wash our feet in the morning and night and make sure they're dry. And I really think also we're required to have milk and cookies at 3 p.m. because, you know, that's also important for us. I mean, it was just such an unrealistic view of their lives. And they didn't want to be blamed for it. So what happened with trench foot is really interesting. You know, the foot, I thought a lot about the foot. It's definitely a symbol of endurance, right? You know, you stand up, you endure. You know, people who lost their feet were considered the real men, and so on and so forth. But a lot of men realized that they were going to die if they stayed on the line, and so they started to use trench foot as a way to get off the line. In other words, they would purposefully get trench foot. And at the beginning of the war, they used to give Purple Hearts for trench foot, and that by the end of the war, that went away. So the foot is fascinating, and I can't even tell you. I mean, I'd love to hear from some of our listeners tonight. Every person I know who's been in a deployment in which they have to walk a lot said the most important piece of equipment is footwear. And I'd love to hear if people agree with that. So it sounds crazy to write a chapter on the foot, but it turned out to be relevant.
Well, we do have 2 comments in the chat already. One, the supply problem, getting the right equipment to the people doing the work was still with us in Vietnam. And another audience member says, as well as in Afghanistan and Iraq. That has not gone away.
Yeah, it's a logistical issue for sure.
But this discussion of the foot also ties into kind of a broader picture that you get into, in that a lot of the soldiers wouldn't get treatment and they didn't want to be seen as heading for the rear and leaving their buddies and not doing their duty. Was that something that was widespread?
It's hard to know. It really is. I have the numbers in the book of how many people died or got trench foot. I can't recall them right now. But there was a whole thing about manliness and stoicism. And I actually trace it back to boot camp. When and I'm sure anybody who's been in boot camp understands this, when you're in boot camp, what people try to do is to test your endurance, to build up your endurance. And so what they do is, like incredibly long marches in bad weather and so on and so forth. And the idea is to push your body as much as you possibly can. And endurance is a very important trait for modern warfare. But the problem was it taught men to ignore their body's pain signals, right? Like you just kept marching even though your feet are killing you, or your feet are wet. And that's what endurance is you learn to ignore pain. And that turned out to be a problem on the line, because men who would feel pain or would feel complete numbness in their feet would just ignore it. And then these men sometimes had to have their feet amputated. So it had a lot to do with stoicism and manliness. And, and it was real, if they went to their officer and he said, oh, you got a little foot problem. There was always this. There were two guys, Italian American soldiers, Rocco and something else, I can't remember. And they're constantly complaining about their feet. And in general, they're complaining about their stomachs and so on and so forth. And so finally, everybody's making fun of them. Finally, they get off the line. One of them had an appendicitis and the other one had his feet removed. So I think, male bonding is all about, be a man, ignore your pain. And that was really tragic for some people. Yeah.
So your fourth chapter is called The Wound, and
Right.
Can you tell us about the kind of the overall conclusions you made and what you talk about in that chapter?
Yeah, what I did in that chapter, of course, if you're going to do the body of war, you have to do wounds. I begin by saying that, in a lot of popular histories of the Second World War, it's always these gruesome, crazy wounds, right? Like intestines falling out or brain being shown. But most of the wounds that were suffered in this chapter, I mostly focus on the British, just because I couldn't do everyone, are just mundane wounds. So I start out with, what wounds were okay and not okay. Guys sat around all the time and talked about, no one wanted to go home without their genitals. I would say that was the most feared wound. And then also fires in tanks. People were really afraid of burns, and then blindness was another. So once I start with wounds with the GIs themselves, then I trace the process of someone who gets wounded and what happens to that person. The stretcher bearing takes you to a field hospital, and that's really a sorting, a triage, right? And then I bring them back into the hospitals, and in the hospitals, you become your wound. You're an arm case or you're a head case. People don't even call you by your name. And then I look a little bit at the doctors and the horrible choices they had to make. Like somebody's going to take 2 hours. This person's going to take an hour. They're both going to die. We'll take one who takes an hour. And save somebody else. I mean, they had terrible choices to make. So the chapter takes everyone through that entire process to healing. And I end the book with a really beautiful image of healing. So that was, and I also look at wound memories. A lot of veterans went back to battlefields and tried to reconstruct their wound story. And there's been some writing about this, that people who go back and they say, okay, I was here, but then I was here, and they talk to their buddies and they read unit histories. They're trying to reconnect the dots in order to feel control or regain the control that they lost when they were wounded. So there's a lot of that stuff in the chapter too.
And you provide as an illustration where one soldier drew a map of the skirmish or action that he was in, and he made absolutely certain that there was an X on the map of where he was wounded. He found it years later, right?
Yeah, no, I got that map at the Imperial War Museum, and it was really beautiful. You know, he just tried to figure it out. And then the other thing is, people always get wounded in hopeless situations. When they talk about their wound stories, it's always can't be helped. You know, they're overwhelmed by the enemy, or they have no ammunition. So it's a way of rethinking the whole sort of break, sort of traumatic break in the narrative, reconstructing it in a way that makes you feel more comfortable.
Well, I'm mostly an 18th century historian, and that map of the wound, and where you talk about folks wanting to find out where it happened and to go back and recreate it. Lafayette in the Revolution was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine outside Pennsylvania, and in 1777, when he came back for his celebrated visit in 1824 and went to Philadelphia, he insisted on being escorted and taken out to the Brandywine battlefield, and he found where he was wounded and showed the people that this is the hill and this is the road and the line. Yep.
Really cool.
50 years, 50 years later. Yep.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. There's something, I mean, I'd be interested in somebody that's listening tonight had that experience too.
So let's wrap up with your final chapter, which is about the corpse. Right. So what did the corpse mean to the soldiers that they saw on the battlefield, or if they were approaching the battlefield where prior action and combat occurred? What did it mean to them?
I started this. In fact, this was the first chapter I wrote because I came across this amazing story from a surgeon named Phillips, and he tells the story of Wally, and this is how I end the book. And Wally had been wounded and he died. And they kept on trying to move through artillery and move through. Now, this is the end of the war where they're moving quickly through Germany. And then they see a German civilian come over, and Wally was well liked, loved in the company. And they see a German woman come over and spit on Wally. And everyone watched it, everyone saw it. And they decided they were going to do something. So the company of infantry, the infantryman company, come over, and then 2 or 3 pick up Wally, and then they start kind of like a march or a parade with Wally to do something to get him to a decent burial ground. And of course, the person in charge immediately stopped them and said, Graves registration will come and do this. This is not for you to do. And they said, too bad, we're going to do it anyways. And they find this beautiful, it was early spring in France or Germany, and they find this absolutely beautiful field full of red and blue flowers. And they carry Wally into this field and they put him down. So he's covered by these tall, beautiful flowers. And then each one in the company comes and pays their respect to Wally. And I just love the story. It's funny that I began with what I ended with. But the end remark of one of the infantrymen was, the gowls of Graves registration is going to come and get him, but we've allowed him to have an honorable burial. So I think, when we look at a dead body, it's a weird double experience because we see both a person that we knew, but then it's not that person anymore, right? You see a body, but it's the body of someone you knew without the soul, if you believe in souls. So I think the GIs looked at the dead body in two ways as well. On the one hand, as a person, as a buddy, as somebody who's got friends, as somebody who's got a wife back home and two kids. But they also saw themselves and others as these, bodies made by the army, these units of force that I was talking about, without personality, without humanity in some ways, just, points on a map, as one of them said. So I think the dead body was a really complex symbol of for soldiers. That on the one hand, it was about these people that they love, but it's also about the taking away of the individual personality by the army and becoming just a body. In this case, a dead body. So that was the inspiration for that chapter.
Okay, we are going to take a couple questions here. Let me get to one by a fellow military historian with the Army. Did you compare overall health of the American, British, and Germans infantry or medical care?
Yeah, okay. Well, I can definitely compare the Allies versus the Germans. The Germans were in terrible health by 1944. They were also starving. They didn't have equipment. I would have to say that the Americans and the British, I didn't see any big difference between them. Remember that by now, I did some French too, by now that the Americans are feeding a lot of the Allied armies and supplying them as well. They're completely supplying the French with uniforms and food. And you can imagine how the French responded to K rations. So there wasn't a huge amount of difference among the Allies, but the Germans were, really suffering physically by 1944 and also 43, because they're in that terrible mountain situation where they're also not getting supplies. Great question. Great question.
Okay, here's another question by another Army historian, friend of ours. And it's very similar to another one, so I'll kind of combine them here. But during the war, did war correspondents like Ernie Pyle give the American public an accurate picture of the actual experiences of combat soldiers? And I guess the other question is very similar, and was the American public aware of the conditions that the GIs went through?
I think they were. More or less. I think Ernie Pyle was somebody who really did, they put Malden and Ernie Pyle together a lot, that Pyle was telling the story that Malden, the cartoonist, was illustrating. I think it took a while for that to trickle back. Ernie Pyle unfortunately left the European theater, went to the Pacific theater and died tragically in the Pacific theater. But I assigned that book that he wrote. I can't remember the name of it. You probably all know it. But it's a series of columns that he wrote. And to me, he's an incredible source for what was really going on, as was Malden. Mm-hmm. But there was censorship, for sure. One of the things, there's a good book by a guy named Roeder about US censorship. They did not show dead bodies a lot, except when they needed money for bonds. So there was censorship, but Ernie Pyle was telling the real story. And my favorite piece of his is the piece he wrote on D-Day. He went a couple days after D-Day, he went back to the beach and wrote about all the flotsam and jetsam that had come up that belonged to soldiers. It's extremely moving. So, yeah.
So one of our audience members asks, will you be following this book up with a book about soldiers in the Pacific Theater?
I'm afraid not. I'm 67 and I'm retiring next year. And I would have to start all over again with the Pacific Theater. There's so much to know. But there was definitely a specific kind of misery to the Pacific, which was completely different. And this is one of the things I say in my introduction. This is one kind of hell. But there were many different kinds of hell. And of course, the Pacific Theater had to do with the jungles and the heat and so on and so forth. So yeah, I'm not going to. Actually, my follow-up now is to look at the bodies of women during the war. And I'm dealing with women in the resistance, for example, women who use their bodies for seductive purposes to get intelligence, to get away with passing documents and so on and so forth. So I moved on to that. Originally, I wanted to have one book, The Body of War. And I realized when I started writing the front part, the line part in Europe, that I was writing two completely different books. So that's next.
Thank you for being with us tonight, Lou Roberts from University of Wisconsin, author of our book talk tonight, Sheer Misery. Again, Professor Roberts, we thank you so much for being with us and giving your evening, and I hope you had a good time.
Can I just say one more thing?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I'm so interested in your stories. Not just Army historians, but veterans. So my email, I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the history department. And my email is my first and last name, Mary Roberts. And at WISC, first four letters of Wisconsin.edu. So if you want to continue the conversation, I would welcome that.
Oh, thank you.
So interested in hearing from you.
Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you so much for the offer.
Yep.
And again, thanks for your time, and we're glad you were with us, and hope to see you again soon. And please come visit us at the National Museum.
Okay. Thank you very much to everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you at the next program.